Getting a little bit of a late start today because I spent 20 minutes in a fast food drive-through. Well, yeah. If you're going to sit there and take the blame for it, yeah, it's your fault. No. Pray for the people down there at McDonald's. Oh, my gosh. We left in plenty of time to get here. It was like 20 minutes. All we wanted was a sausage biscuit and a sweet tea. And we got nothing. Anyway, we're going to pick it up where we left off last week in Mark. We're going to take our time and go through this book slowly, so we'll be in Mark probably come Valentine's Day. But we left off in verse 29 of chapter 1 of Mark. And we're going to talk today about the purpose of God's servant, preaching the gospel. Worship in the synagogue, if you remember, Jesus was in the synagogue, and worship in the synagogue took place on the Sabbath or the seventh day of the week. And Jesus taught in the synagogue in the morning, and the events of our lessons show us the things that he did during the rest of that day and the days following. This is what this lesson that we're going to be studying for the next couple of weeks is going over. What we're going to look at in the lesson today gives us an interesting perspective on how the Bible records various events. In verse 29 through 34 that we're looking at today, we find an expanded record of a few hours in the life of Jesus. And then in the rest of these verses that we'll look at next week, we see a far more condensed version of events that are going to take place over several days, perhaps even several weeks. It was not the purpose of the writers of the Gospels to give us a day-by-day diary of Jesus' life. A lot of people think that the Bible is a day-by-day diary. It's not. What was it John said? If everything was written about him, there wouldn't be enough books or letters or libraries in the world. Right, could hold it. But instead, each of these writers was inspired to focus on a particular aspect of the life and ministry of Jesus. So Mark wrote, and what did I've compared Mark to the action book. And if you don't learn anything else, I want you to understand that the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was action. It's all about action. He uses the word immediately, forthright, right away they go, forthway, straight away. He uses those words over and over and over again. Healing the sick and casting out demons. Verse 29 of Mark chapter 1, he starts off with the word, and forthwith. And forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, remember last week he was in the synagogue, he cast out the demon, he was teaching, everybody was amazed at how this man taught with authority. As soon as that was over with, and forthwith, Mark says, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, and anon, and that word anon, I had to look it up, it means very shortly. And anon, they tell him of her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. And that even when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed of with devils. And all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers and diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 6 verses have a lot of information that if you just read what I just read, you'd skip over a lot of information that Mark just gave us. We're going to focus on a few hours in Jesus' life right now, but these few hours are recorded in these 6 verses. And there's a lot of stuff that you might learn that you might never know, or that you might never knew, I meant. For example, Mark places Jesus and his disciples in a domestic scene here. And no information is given directly, but what Mark does not say or describe is almost as important as what he does say and describe. We did not know that Peter and Andrew lived in Capernaum, did we? I didn't know that. And many more, and any more than we expected that Peter was married. Did y'all know that Peter was married? Peter had a wife? Mark just told us. A lot of people don't realize stuff like that. Jesus just called his disciples and went about his ministry, right? You don't hear a lot about these people's personal lives. Jesus, with Simon, Andrew, with James and John, went to Simon and Andrew's house. They lived together. They were brothers, were they not? Remember, Jesus called these brothers. They were fishing. They were actually fishing with nets when Jesus called them. They were in the act of fishing when Jesus called Simon and Andrew. Folks, they lived together. Most days, kids grow up and leave the house. It's normal, but other times, they stay at home. How did New Hope start? We just had our 25th year celebration, right? How did New Hope start? Where did it start? In a basement of somebody's house. Now, we're going to get into that. Maybe you'll see that here in these verses that we're going to look at today. But anyway, after the service at the synagogue, Jesus, James, and John went to the home of Simon and Andrew, which lived in Capernaum. At this time, it wasn't unusual for extended families to share a house. Andrew and Simon and their extended families evidently did so, because Simon's wife's mother lived there and she was sick. And when they came home, Simon's mother-in-law was sick. Simon and Andrew told Jesus about her illness. Now, remember that word anon? Shortly, I can just picture they're walking in the door, and Simon turns around and says, hey, we better tell, Simon says to Andrew, hey, we better tell Jesus that, she's sick, not to expect too much food or drink, or maybe it was their house that they were, or maybe it was her house that they were living in. The Scriptures doesn't tell us that, but it does tell us that they lived together. And I find that interesting, because a lot of times you just skip over that when you read the verses. But perhaps it was to explain why the meal had not been prepared, or any other hospitality. It's also possible that they wanted Jesus and those with him to avoid catching the fever. We just went through a pandemic, didn't we? How many times were you told not to go around somebody? Don't get near them. We even stopped coming to church for a while because we didn't want to get other people sick. Jesus reacted in love and sympathy for this woman. And he went where she was. He took her hand and lifted her up, and immediately her fever left. Jesus took the initiative here. Hearing about her illness, he went to her and healed her. He didn't make any demands of her. He didn't ask her any questions. He just simply demonstrated that his power over her disease, and he made her well. And then she was able to minister to her guests, because, we don't think about it this way with our modern medicine, do we? Jesus showed absolute fearlessness in having physical contact with a woman who had a fever. Julie starts sneezing, and it's funny when you're around people who don't know Julie and she starts sneezing like that. Some of them will even step away. I laugh. Because she doesn't sneeze no less than 3 or 4 times. A lot of people will act scared around other sick people, won't they? Jesus showed absolute fearlessness. They told him, hey, she's got a fever. Jesus didn't say a word. He just went to her right away, picked up her hand, and the fever left. Didn't ask her any questions. Didn't say, hey, how are you feeling? What's wrong with you? He simply demonstrated his power over her disease. Fever is an indication of a lot of diseases. And many of them are contagious and deadly. But what's important here is Jesus was not afraid to touch those who were sick. He had the power over that disease. If I get around you and you got a fever, I might catch it. I'm going going to tell you something. I work for a school district, but I'm not inside the buildings all the time. And that's a good thing. I don't get sick very often. I'm not around those kids. But I live with a teacher, and she brings this garbage home to me all the time. She takes vitamin C every day, but then she brings home whatever is on her, and I get it. This healing was done on the Sabbath. Jesus was asserting that he was Lord of the Sabbath and that he had power to immediately reverse the symptoms of the disease. This was a crisis, not a process. The lady was healed instantly. You ever been sick? You ever had a fever? What do you feel like? You just wish it'd go away, don't you? I remember when I had COVID, laid up in bed. Julie brought me a Diet Coke, and I asked for a regular Coke. I got mad at her because I couldn't taste the Coke. I thought it was diet. I asked her, I said, why don't you bring me a Diet Coke? She goes, this regular Coke. Well, I'm just telling you what it tasted like. But I can remember laying up there and just wanting it all to go away and be better again. It was nice outside. I remember the sun was shining. It was beautiful. I could hear people outside cutting the grass. They were playing music. It was a good time, and I'm laid up in bed doing nothing because I didn't feel good. I just wanted it to go away. Remember when you ever had a fever and your head hurt and you just want the headache to go away? That's exactly what Jesus did. He made it go away instantly. It was done on the Sabbath. He was asserting that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. And as the sun was setting and the Sabbath was ended, many who were diseased or possessed of devils, the Scripture says, were brought to Jesus. Folks, this was a large crowd. They are in a small house. A lot of people live in this house. The extended family was living there. The whole city, the Scripture says, was assembled, does it not? Where does it say it? And even as the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased and were possessed. Verse 33. And all the city, it didn't say some of the city, it didn't say part of the city, and all the city was gathered at the door. How big is the city? I'm sure it wasn't as big as Chicago. Probably wasn't even as big as Plano back then. Let's just say the city had 1,500 people. Let's just say the city had 500 people. I don't know. It doesn't give us a number. But all the city was there. Everybody that lived in that city showed up at that door. 200? Will 100, will that number suffice as a bunch of people for us today? Or do we have to think about 500? I don't know. But all the city showed up. The whole city was assembled at the door of the home of Andrew and Simon. And Jesus once again responded in love and kindness for these people. We don't know their names. We don't know the specific diseases they had. But Jesus healed many of them. You know what I find interesting? All these people show up at the door. Jesus didn't just wave his hand, snap his fingers, and they were all healed. No, he had the power to do that, but that's not what he did. He could have, but Jesus had a personal ministry, and he dealt with as many of these people as he could personally. Jesus also cast out, but not all of the demons. Jesus also cast out many, but not all of the demons who inflicted such suffering on their host. Jesus had previously done that in the synagogue earlier that day, right? Remember last week? He told that guy, or he told that demon. The demon says, I know who you are. Why are you here? And Jesus told him to pretty much hush up. He silenced him. Do y'all remember that? That's important. Because these evil spirits, once again, the Scriptures tells us, were not allowed to speak because they knew who Jesus was. Once again, we see that the evil spirits recognized what evil men would not, that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. And why didn't Jesus heal everybody? You ever wondered that? How come Jesus didn't heal everybody? Talking to people, I get asked that question a lot. Well, if Jesus could heal everybody, how come he didn't do it? He had the power to do it. He could eradicate any illness or deformity that he came across. He made the blind man to see, didn't he? We read about that in the Scriptures. He made the lame to walk. He made the deaf to hear. But he didn't make all the blind people to see, and he didn't make all the lame people to walk, and he didn't make all the deaf people to hear. You know, when Jesus died on the cross, there were still sick people. There were still handicapped people all over the world and in Israel. And the answer is that was not his main purpose. His main purpose was not to come here and heal the sick people. His main purpose was not to come here to heal the deaf and to make the lame to walk and to cast out devils. That wasn't the reason he came. He did it, but he didn't do it for everybody. Jesus didn't come here to heal physical problems. He came to deal with a much more important matters, and that was the matter of the Spirit. Everyone Jesus healed later died. But those who were saved when he preached the gospel, folks, they're still saved today. The miracles that Jesus demonstrated of his power were designed to show that people were designed to show people that they should believe his message. I think I skipped over something, but I didn't want to skip over. Let me go back. Nope, I pretty much covered it. That's all we're going to go today because I don't want to rush through this. We're going to talk about him praying and preaching next week. But verses 29 through 34. And forthwith, right after they left the synagogue, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew. That's what I want us to understand today. They were brothers. They were called while they were fishing. Immediately, they were actively fishing. I'm recapping a little bit of last week so that you understand the story, so that we don't lose it. And not only did they go into Simon and Andrew's house, but they brought James and John with him, who had left their father's fishing business. And then we learn in verse 30 that Simon's wife, Simon was later called Peter, so Peter was married. Peter's wife's mama was sick. And they tell him of her. They say, hey, she's got a fever, man. I don't know if they told him don't go back there because she's got a fever. I don't know if they told him, hey, she's sick because that's why there's no food on the table yet. They just said, hey, she's got a fever. Jesus didn't ask questions because Mark says, and he came and he took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her. Didn't ask her how she was feeling, didn't ask her if she felt okay, didn't ask her if she wanted to be healed, didn't ask her a question, just took her hand and lifted her up. Boom. Man, I bet she felt great. She probably felt so great, she probably made some biscuits and gravy and threw it on the table for him right then and there with a jug of sweet tea. I don't know. See, when I study, this is how I study sometimes so that I can understand it. Well, it says, and she ministered unto them. Now, ministered unto me, that's how I take the word ministered. I don't know. It's just the way I study, folks. I ain't saying that's what she did. She might have thrown a T-bone steak on the grill. Who knows? You don't know. The Scripture doesn't say she didn't. It doesn't say she did either. It just says she ministered unto them. And even when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased and them that were possessed with devils, and all the city. That's what gets me. Everybody in the city was there. Remember last week where we learned he was at earlier that day? He was at the synagogue. Who was at the synagogue? Word spread, folks. You see that? Why else would everybody in the city come to Simon and Andrew's house? Why? They had heard. There's a dude that casted out a devil. And he's over at Simon and Andrew's house right now. Come on, Mama, with your peg leg, let's go get it fixed. Why else would they show up over there? Word had spread. That's what had happened. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases and cast out many devils and suffered not that the devils to speak. That's important. Those devils didn't even speak. Remember the one last week or the one that we learned last week, earlier in the day when he was in the synagogue? He told that one to shut up, and it didn't speak. He shut these up too. And I find that interesting because they knew him. They knew what was about to happen. Like I said, I just wanted to recap a little bit before we go on next week, because next week we're going to learn a lot about. This week we pretty much learned what he did on just that one day between the scriptures of last week and the 6 verses that we looked at today. Next week, though, Mark covers about, a week, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know. But this happened in just a few hours of the day. Lord, thank you for the day. Thank you.